Hello, my name is Nina, and my story is about the time my father passed away. I expected it to be sad, of course, but what I hadn't expected was that my father had left me with a huge family secret that would flip my world upside down. I know my father will seem like the bad guy here, but try not to judge him before you hear what really happened from the start. Growing up, it was always just me and my father. My mother passed away when I was only 2 years old, so my father raised me by himself. However, when I was around 15 years old, my father fell ill, and as I grew older, he wasn't able to leave his bed much. It made me feel so depressed. That time in my life was extremely difficult, especially because I didn't know how to handle it. The tension between my father and I got incredibly intense because we knew that he would shortly pass away. During that time, I started asking him all kinds of questions about our family, things that we had never really discussed. You see, I had no one but my father. No extended family, and I always wondered why my grandparents hadn't had any more children. I always hated that he never really answered the questions I had when I looked at his old family photos, especially when I wanted to know who the little girl in the photos was. She was there in every single one. One time, he told me that it was their neighbor's daughter that they had to take care of after her parents passed away. And when I asked him about her a while after, he said that she was his cousin that died at a young age. His story was never consistent, and he would forget the lie that he had told me every time. That's how I knew something was up. And when I confronted him, he got angry and said that it was none of my business. Later that day, I saw him crying alone in his room. After a while, I decided to let it go. My questions had caused him pain and anger, and he already had enough on his plate. Around the time I was 18, my father passed away. I knew the day was coming. We had many conversations about what would change after he was gone, but it still hit me hard knowing that he wouldn't be there anymore. On the day of his funeral, I was surprised by how many people showed up because we didn't really know a lot of people. They were mostly my father's acquaintances that he'd made while he was in the hospital and the neighbors that lived around us. They couldn't really be called friends, as none of them had known him that well, but it was kind of them to pay their respects. That day, I walked around shaking hands, receiving hugs, and thanking everybody for coming before it was time for them to leave. At the end of the day, my father was gone, and I was all alone. A couple of months after the funeral, I was finally ready to move on. I was about to start college and was excited to start a new chapter in my life. Every week since he had passed away, I made a trip to his grave to replace the flowers on his tombstone and to have a little talk with him. I would tell him about all of my problems and think about the way that he would respond if he was there with me. After a while, it became a routine that I looked forward to. That was until one particular day when something weird happened that changed everything I had ever known about my father. I began noticing that someone was leaving weird-looking flowers at my father's grave about once a week. At first, I didn't give it much thought, but with time, I got curious. Every time it would be black roses and thistles. I found it strange and a bit disrespectful. Who would leave such a thing on someone's grave? The longer it kept happening, the more annoyed I got, until one time, the person who was leaving black roses and thistles on my father's grave revealed herself. One day, as I was walking towards my father's grave, I noticed a woman walking away. She looked like a nice person, so I figured she might have just been walking by. But once I got closer to my father's grave, I noticed something odd. The black roses and thistles on his tombstone were fresh, and beside them, I noticed that something was carved onto the stone. It said, "I will never forgive you." I was really confused. All kinds of thoughts were running through my head when the groundskeeper passed by. I walked up to him and asked about the woman. I asked him if he knew anything about her. He told me that she'd been coming for a while now, once a week around the same time. I couldn't believe that we had never crossed paths. But even more, I needed to know who she was. I'd never seen her before, so I knew she wasn't a local. And how had she known my dad? With my curiosity piqued, I decided to see if she would come back the next week on the same day. When the day finally came, I drove up to the cemetery and waited for most of the day. The hours passed by, and I was starting to think she wasn't going to come. However, a couple of minutes later, there she was. It was time to get the answers that I'd been wanting for a week. I tapped her on her shoulder, and she turned around. At first, her face was filled with shock, but it quickly turned to joy. I was creeped out. "Excuse me, I'm Nina. Can you tell me your name?" But then she took my hand in hers. "I know who you are, Nina. I'm Kim." She looked at me deeply. "It's so nice to see you in person," she said, staring at me with fondness in her eyes. "Wow, you're certainly their spitting image." I started to panic. Who was she? And how did she know my name? I tried to stay calm and said nervously that my father thought I looked more like my grandma. She just chuckled and said, "Yeah, that's who I was talking about." "You knew my grandma?" "Of course I did," she said, still smiling. "I mean, she was my mother too, after all." She reached into her pockets again and pulled out a wallet. When she opened it, there was a picture of her, my dad, and their parents standing in front of a church. Seconds must have turned into minutes, but I was just too shocked to speak. So she broke the silence first. "I didn't mean to scare you. If you want, we could walk up to the diner across the street and I'll answer anything that you want." I was scared, but I needed answers, so I agreed. We sat in the back of the diner away from the noise. Sitting across from her in the diner, a lot of questions ran through my mind. My hand started to fidget nervously while I tried to process all of the thoughts in my head. In the end, it was no use in trying, and I just blurted out the first thing on my mind. "Are you like my aunt?" She nodded. "Why didn't my father mention you before?" This question finally wiped the smile off her face. She sighed heavily before telling me the whole story. "You know, your father and I were close when we were kids. I always looked up to my big brother and would do everything I could to spend time with him. My life as a child was ideal. My parents were loving and the community was friendly. My dad was a local pastor and many in the community idolized him. I guess to a certain extent, we did too." She paused. We never wanted to disappoint him. However, when I was in my early teens, I realized I never wanted to be with a man. I was a lesbian. I really liked this girl, and we started dating in private. Your dad was the first to find out, but promised to keep my secret until I was ready. But he broke his promise. He had told them. Our mom was stunned, and Dad, well, he was furious. He screamed and tried to force me into changing my mind, as if I could. And when they saw that I wasn't going to change, they kicked me out of the house. I wasn't surprised at their actions, but when I looked at my big brother, expecting him to be on my side, he turned away. I was devastated. Our parents could hardly look at me, and my brother backed anything our father said. I left the house, and my girlfriend helped me start a new life. It was the last I heard from my family, until I received this. She pulled out a letter and handed it to me. It was a note from my father. "Dear Kimberly, I know I wasn't there for you when you needed me, and I have no right to ask you to be there for me. But I hope you will consider forgiving me. There's more I would like to say in person, but I'm afraid I wasted too much time. I have a daughter. Her name is Nina. I haven't told her about you, but I would love for you to meet her. Only if you'd be comfortable with it, of course. If I can't see you before the end, I just want you to know that I miss you, love you, and I am truly sorry. With love, Thomas." I looked up from the paper and saw tears in her eyes. It was nice to know that he didn't hate me, but I still have lots of mixed feelings towards him. I am trying hard to find forgiveness in my heart, but it's not that simple. At that point, things began to make sense, but I couldn't be mad at her. She was obviously angry with my father for a good reason, and she never got any closure. I reached out, grabbed her hand, and assured her that I'd be there from now on, because she was my family, and I was beyond happy to meet her and to finally know my family secret.
John and I have been together for 4 years. Our relationship has been perfect until we used a pregnancy test and found out that John was pregnant. During the last year, John started to change. He no longer called me, and he avoided me at school as well. I had to figure out what has been going on with him. So I sent him a message saying, "Did I do something wrong?" And he replied, "Listen, I think that we should put an end to our relationship. If you really cared for me, you would have done the thing that would have made me happy." I wasn't ready to break up with John yet. He treated me well and has always been kind to me. I couldn't imagine my life without him. Without a second thought, I replied to his message, "I will do what you want me to do," and that was it. I can't say that it was the best, but it was okay, I guess. I couldn't really tell. I've never been with anyone else before John. He also managed to convince me that there was absolutely no chance for me to get pregnant on the first time. Our relationship returned back to normal after we did it. I would even say that it became even better. But a month later, my period was late and I panicked. I called John and told him that I was pregnant. I couldn't find any other logical explanation for what was happening. But he only laughed and said that I was blowing the situation out of proportion and told me that he would buy me a pregnancy test and drop by. I agreed to a suggestion only on one condition. I told him he must bring 2 tests, not 1. When John arrived, I had absolutely no idea how to use a pregnancy test. I grabbed one of the tests and handed it to John and said, "Okay, you first." He looked at me and smiled and said, "Hey, pretty face. It seems that you've got the wrong idea. You're the one that has to pee over it, not me." It sounded like complete madness to me. All I wanted to know was if there was a baby in my uterus or not. John noticed how hesitant I was, so he grabbed the pregnancy test and went to the bathroom. A few minutes later, he came out with a look of confusion all over his face. He was hiding the test behind his back. He didn't want to show me the result he got until I take my turn and use the test as well. It took me some time. When I came out of the bathroom, he looked at my test and laughed. He said, "See, you're not pregnant. Your period must have been a little late, that's all." Yes, these kinds of things happen from time to time, but why was he hiding his test? And why did he look confused when he saw it? I took the chance when he wasn't looking and stole his test. And what I discovered left me speechless. My test came negative, while his turned out to be positive. How could it be? How could John be pregnant? Didn't he just tell me that pregnancy test was meant to be used by females only? Oh my God. Did that mean my test was inaccurate? I panicked all over again. But John, trying to calm me down, told me that we could simply buy some more of those tests and try again. Oh God. But what other option did I have? John went to the pharmacy and returned with more of those test sticks, a big bottle of water, and 4 Coca-Cola cans. Because, as you probably know, we needed them so that we could go to the bathroom. We tried more than 20 test sticks. Every single one of mine came out negative, while every test stick that John used came out positive. Despite the situation being disgusting, I mean, it had to be, all that urine, ew, it was still funny. I looked at John and said, "Could it be that you are pregnant with my child?" And we both broke into laughter. John even took a selfie with the dozens of positive pregnancy tests that he had. He then posted the photo to his Instagram account with the caption that said, "It looks like I don't need a partner to be a dad. Yes, all these positive tests are mine." We spent the whole night reading comments and laughing, and most importantly, I finally got my period that night. On the next day at school, everyone gathered around us and asked, "Is it true that all those positive pregnancy tests were John's, or is it just a silly joke?" But John answered with pride, "Yes, they are all mine." Knowing that everyone in school knew that John and I had sex still made me feel uncomfortable. It should have been a private experience that no one else but me and John should have known about. A few days after we had posted the photo, the cheerleading team leader approached me and informed me that the team had decided to cut me off, as they believed that it was not right to keep me in the team while I was pregnant. They believed that my belly would eventually get bigger and I would look ridiculous dancing with my big belly and short skirt all at once. They would definitely be ashamed of me for that. I tried once and again to convince her that I wasn't pregnant, but she insisted that no one believed John's lie, and that was it. As you can probably see, my life took a turn for the worse. While John was enjoying his unrivaled popularity due to his wittiness, I was witnessing my life falling apart, one piece after another. More than 2 months passed by while I refused to speak to John. Even though I was the one who encouraged him to post the photo in the first place, I still blamed him for all that happened. At first, John did not care that much about speaking to me again. He even got himself a new girlfriend. However, during the last week, he started calling and texting me once again on a daily basis, but I never returned any of his calls or messages. I felt extremely mad at him. During gym class, John approached the gym teacher and told him that he will not be able to continue the class as he was feeling pain in his lower abdomen, but the teacher only looked at him in ridicule and said, "First, your pregnancy test comes back positive, and now you're having your period. What is next? Will you grow a pair of breasts next?" Poor John felt extremely embarrassed, and everyone distanced themselves from John. No one wanted to be friends with the guy who was slowly turning into a girl, but for me, I felt very sorry for him. I went to him and said, "Listen, you don't have to attract everyone's attention to be seen as an interesting person. You once were perfect in everyone's eyes. I wish you would stop acting weird and that you would return back to your old self." He started to cry out loud and said, "No one wants to believe me, even you." At that moment, the mean cheerleading team leader approached us and said, "Hey, look at that. It seems that our hormones are confused. Please be kind to Mrs. John." That loser. She really stepped on my last nerve with her uncalled for comment. I jumped on her and started pulling her hair, but the coach held me and pulled us apart. He ordered us to go to the principal's office. On our way to the principal's office, I looked at my palm and saw a strand of her hair still stuck between my fingers, while John held tightly onto my other hand. I didn't want to leave his hand. I really felt like there was something going on with him. While we waited to be called into the principal's office, John looked at me and apologized for what had happened to me because of him. He was very upset because he made me choose between ending our relationship or having sex with him. He even told me that he was thankful for me because I stood up for him and it meant a lot to him. For a second, I thought that he was going to tell me that he was willing to give our relationship a second chance. And honestly, I was willing to do so in a heartbeat as well. But his new girlfriend walked in and ruined everything. Once she saw him, she jumped on him and they both shared a long, warm kiss. He didn't seem to mind one bit. Once again, I couldn't stay calm. It was too much for me to bear. I pushed her away from him and kicked him in the nuts. He screamed his lungs out and fell unconscious. A few seconds went by, and he was being carried to the ambulance that took him to the hospital. I was in knee-deep problems. I thought that final incident would definitely get me grounded for life. Over the course of the next few days, John was no longer to be seen around school, and I didn't hear anything about him. I know that I might look stupid to you, but I was worried about him anyways. I felt that I had caused him some serious problem when I kicked him, but I honestly never thought that my kick was that strong. I had to check on him, but how would I do so? His phone was off all the time. There was no other way. I had to go to his new girlfriend and ask her about him. When I asked her about John, she told me, "That fool broke up with me and I don't care what happens to him. He can go to hell." My back was to the wall. I had no other way to check on John than to go visit him at his home. And that was what I did. When I visited him, he looked even worse than ever. However, he was thrilled to see me and told me that kicking him in the balls was the best thing that has ever happened to him, and that if I hadn't kicked him in the balls, he would have been doomed for sure. Despite that, he told me that he was totally desperate. He had lost his testicles for good. Everything finally started to make sense. John's pregnancy tests were indeed positive, but that wasn't because the tests were bad. It was because John was suffering from testicular cancer. The pains he had been suffering from weren't made up by him so that he could get more attention from people around him. They were very real. Testicular cancer? That must be the worst thing that could ever happen to any guy. What started as a joke ended as a disaster. Not only that, but also the only way of treatment for his case was the complete amputation of his testicles. I promised myself that day that I will never let John face all that on his own. Despite the fact that he had left me all alone before, this was totally different. I was with him When he went to surgery to get his testicles removed, all of that worked in our favor. With his testicles removed, there was no way at all that he would get me pregnant. He feels that our relationship has become perfect and stress-free.